What if I told you there's a country that went completely bankrupt, let its banks collapse, arrested its bankers, and came back stronger than ever in less than a decade? This isn't a fantasy. This is Iceland. Welcome to the greatest economic comeback story you've never heard. In 2008, when the global financial crisis hit, most countries did the same thing. They bailed out the banks, they printed money, they protected the financial system at all costs. But one tiny island nation in the North Atlantic did the exact opposite. They let their banks fail, they prosecuted the bankers, and they rebuilt their economy from the ground up. Today on the Economic Autopsy, we're diving deep into Iceland's incredible story, from the dizzying heights of the Viking banking era to the pots and pans revolution to becoming one of the world's most resilient economies. This is a masterclass in what happens when a country chooses its people over its banks. The Viking bankers building a house of cards. Let's set the stage. Iceland, early 2000s. Population 320,000 people. For context, that's about the same as Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. For most of its history, Iceland's economy was simple: fish, aluminum, and geothermal energy. Stable, predictable, boring even. Then came the deregulation. In 2001, Iceland privatized its banking sector. Almost overnight, three main banks, Kaupthing, Glitnir, and Landsbanki, went from sleepy local lenders to international financial predators. These weren't just banks anymore, they were Viking raiders in Armani suits. They started offering ridiculously high interest rates to foreign savers, particularly in Britain and the Netherlands, through online accounts called IceSave. Money poured in, billions of euros and pounds. With all this cash, the banks went on a global shopping spree. They bought Danish airlines, British department stores, and Norwegian power companies. At one point, Icelandic investors even tried to buy a controlling stake in the American retail giant Target. Here's the mind-blowing statistic. At their peak in 2007, Iceland's three major banks held assets worth about 14 billion euros. That's roughly 10 times Iceland's entire GDP. 10 times. Let that sink in. Imagine if your personal debt was 10 times your annual salary. You'd be eating instant noodles for the rest of your life. Iceland was living on borrowed time and borrowed money on a scale never seen before.
The crash, when the Vikings met reality. September 2008, Lehman Brothers collapses in New York, the global credit market freezes, and Iceland's house of cards begins to tremble. See, Iceland's banks had a fatal flaw. They were borrowing short-term money on international markets to fund their long-term investments. When credit dried up, they couldn't roll over their debt. The music stopped, and Iceland didn't have a chair. Then came the moment that would define a generation. October 6, 2008, Icelandic Prime Minister Geir Haarde goes on national television with one of the most chilling announcements in economic history. He tells the nation, and I'm paraphrasing here, "Our banks have failed. Our currency is collapsing. We face national bankruptcy." National bankruptcy. For a modern European country in the 21st century, it was unthinkable. In the span of 1 week, all three major banks collapsed. The Icelandic Króna lost half its value against the euro. The stock market fell by 90%. 90%! The average Icelander lost about 30% of their purchasing power overnight. And here's where it gets really wild. Britain actually used anti-terrorism laws to freeze Icelandic assets. Yes, anti-terrorism laws against a country whose biggest threats were volcanoes and cold weather. The pots and pans revolution. What happens when 320,000 people wake up to find their country is bankrupt? They get angry. But Icelanders didn't just get angry, they got organized. In what became known as the pots and pans revolution, thousands of Icelanders gathered outside Parliament every day, banging kitchenware, blowing whistles, demanding change. No violence, no riots, just the deafening sound of a population saying enough. The protests worked. In January 2009, the government collapsed. A new coalition took over, and they did something radical. They let the banks fail. Not a bailout, a bail-in. Foreign creditors, mostly European banks and investors, took massive losses. The Icelandic government protected domestic depositors first. They essentially said to the international financial community, "You made bad bets. You deal with the consequences." But here's where Iceland really diverged from the rest of the world. They started arresting bankers. Actual arrests, handcuffs, perp walks, the whole thing. By 2015, more than 30 bankers had been convicted and sentenced to prison. The former CEO of Kaupthing got 4.5 years. The former CEO of Glitnir got 5 years. Even the former prime minister was put on trial. Think about that. In the entire 2008 financial crisis across the entire globe, Iceland was the only country that consistently sent bankers to prison.
The recovery, the Icelandic model. So now Iceland is bankrupt. Its currency is worthless. Its banking sector is gone. What next? This is where Iceland's small size became its greatest strength. They implemented what economists now call the Icelandic model, and it had 4 key pillars. First, debt forgiveness. Iceland wrote down household debt. They passed laws that allowed people to walk away from mortgages that were underwater. They essentially hit the reset button on personal finance for ordinary citizens. Second, capital controls. They temporarily restricted money from leaving the country. This stopped a complete currency collapse and gave them breathing room. Third, investment in people, not banks. While other countries were slashing social programs, Iceland maintained and even strengthened its welfare state. Free healthcare, free education, generous unemployment benefits. They understood that protecting people wasn't just morally right, it was economically smart. And fourth, they diversified their economy away from finance. The new Icelandic economy. Without banks, Iceland went back to basics. First, tourism. The collapsed Króna made Iceland suddenly affordable. Then Game of Thrones started filming there. Instagram exploded with pictures of the Northern Lights. Tourism went from 500,000 visitors in 2010 to over 2 million today. That's 7 tourists for every Icelander. Second, technology and innovation. Iceland invested heavily in startups, particularly in green energy, data centers, and biotechnology. Today, Iceland has more startups per capita than anywhere in Europe. Third, they doubled down on their natural advantages. Iceland now generates 100% of its electricity from renewable sources, geothermal and hydropower. They're even exploring exporting their green energy expertise. The results speak for themselves. By 2015, just 7 years after total collapse, Iceland's GDP was back to pre-crisis levels. Unemployment fell from 9% to under 4%. They paid back their IMF loans early. Today, Iceland consistently ranks among the world's happiest, most equal, and most innovative countries. Compare that to Greece, which followed the conventional austerity playbook. Greece's economy shrank by 25%. Youth unemployment hit 50%. Iceland recovered in 7 years. Greece is still recovering 15 years later. Conclusion, the lessons. So what can we learn from Iceland's incredible story? First, size matters in a crisis. Iceland's small, homogeneous population made radical policy changes possible in ways they wouldn't be in larger, more diverse countries.
Second, sometimes letting failing institutions fail is the right move. Iceland proved that not all banks are too big to fail. Third, justice matters. Holding bankers accountable wasn't just about punishment, it was about restoring public trust in the entire system. And finally, compassionate. It was the fastest way to restart economic growth. Iceland's story asks us an uncomfortable question. What if we've been doing economics wrong this whole time? What if protecting people is more important than protecting banks? What if justice isn't just moral, it's economically necessary? Iceland didn't just recover from economic collapse, they reinvented themselves. From arrogant bankers to humble innovators, from financial fantasy to sustainable reality. Their story proves that sometimes you have to burn it all down to build something better. Thanks for watching the Economic Autopsy. If you enjoyed this story of the little island that could, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Let us know in the comments, should more countries have followed Iceland's lead? Until next time, stay curious.